The seat was still warm. Senator Voreth noticed this when he sat down at the curved dais of the Galactic Senate's emergency session chamber 3 minutes after the human delegation had vacated it. He noticed because the material the Senate used for its seating was a thermal composite that returned to ambient temperature within 90 seconds of a body leaving it, a property he knew because he had once, during a particularly long session, asked the facility's staff about it. Whatever the humans had been doing in this chamber, they had been doing it very recently. The session had been called for 0800. The human delegation had been present at 0730, according to the chamber's entry log. They had left at 0756. No explanation. No communication to the session chair. No request for a delay or a rescheduling. They had simply stood up and walked out for minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, leaving behind 3 items that the chamber's security staff had photographed and logged but not moved, because nothing in the security protocol covered this specific situation. The 3 items were on the human delegation's table. A single physical document, printed on actual paper, which was unusual enough in the Senate's digital environment that it had drawn comment from the 2 staff members who discovered it. A small object that the security log described as unidentified personal item appears to be a manufactured keepsake or memorial object, and which Voreth recognized, from a distance, as a photograph in a frame. And a data chip, unlabeled, standing upright against the photograph's frame in a position that could not have been accidental. The session chair called the chamber to order. 49 senators from 37 member species arranged themselves in the curved amphitheater of a room designed to communicate the weight of collective authority. The human delegation's seats remained empty. This was not unprecedented. Member species occasionally sent regrets for scheduled sessions, but it was unprecedented for a session specifically convened to address a motion that required the presence of the species the motion concerned, because this session had been called for one purpose: to formally receive humanity's response to Senate Resolution 7 Tau. Resolution 7 Tau had passed 11 days ago by a margin of 31-6, with 12 abstentions, which was a comfortable majority by Senate standards and which the resolution's architects had characterized as a clear expression of collective will. The resolution required humanity to reduce its active warship fleet to a number not exceeding what the Senate's Strategic Oversight Committee had determined was proportional to Earth's current threat environment and consistent with regional stability. The number the committee had determined was 9. Humanity currently maintained, across its home system and colonial territories, 412 active warships, a number that the Strategic Oversight Committee had described in its supporting documentation as significantly disproportionate to any legitimate defensive requirement, and that 3 of the resolution's co-sponsors had called, in floor speeches that Voreth had watched in full, a destabilizing presence incompatible with Senate membership in good standing. The resolution also required a response within 15 days. 11 days had passed. The session had been called to receive the response. The human delegation had left before the session began and had left 3 objects on their table. Voreth was the Senate's procedural chair, which meant the running of this session was his responsibility, and the running of this session had become complicated before it started. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at the 3 objects on the table. He called a 5-minute recess for security consultation, which was the procedurally correct way to buy himself time to think, and he spent 4 of those 5 minutes looking at the items from across the chamber and using the remaining minute to have a very brief and very tense conversation with the session's security lead about whether any of the 3 items presented a physical risk. The security lead said no. Then he said, quietly, that he thought the procedural chair might want to look at the document before reconvening. Voreth crossed to the human delegation's table. The document was 2 pages. It was written in standard compact diplomatic language, which was the Senate's formal operating language, which meant it had been prepared for this audience specifically. The handwriting, actual handwriting, not printed text, was precise and even the handwriting of someone who had written by hand often enough that it no longer required particular care to be legible. He read the first paragraph standing at the table. He read the second paragraph. He sat down in the nearest chair, which happened to be the human delegation's chair, which was still warm, and he read the rest. The document was not a response to Resolution 7 Tau in the sense the resolution had anticipated. It did not accept the reduction requirement. It did not negotiate a modified number. It did not invoke procedural objection or request an extension. What it did was something that Vorith Keel, in 22 years of Senate service, had never seen a member species do in formal documentation. It explained. Not defensively. Not diplomatically. It explained with the calm, thorough specificity of someone who has decided that the person they're speaking to needs to understand something completely and is not going to soften the information to make it easier to receive. The document was signed at the bottom by the full human delegation, 6 names in the same careful handwriting, and beneath the signatures was a single line that was not part of the formal text but appeared to have been added last. It said, *, we will be in the delegation waiting area. We are available to discuss this. We did not leave because we are unwilling to engage. We left because we needed you to read this before we could have a conversation that would mean anything. *. Vorith Keel looked at the data chip standing against the photograph frame. He looked at the photograph itself. It showed a group of people in what appeared to be a human military context, uniforms, a vessel visible in the background, and the people in it were arranged the way people arrange themselves when someone is taking a picture they intend to keep. Informal. Close together. The kind of photograph taken at the end of something, or the beginning. He did not yet know why it was here. He reconvened the session. He read the first 2 paragraphs of the document aloud, which was sufficient to produce the specific quality of silence from 49 senators that told him he had made the correct procedural decision to read it before reconvening. Then he called a formal recess and went to the delegation waiting area to find the humans. There were 6 of them. They were sitting in the waiting area's chairs in the manner of people who have been there for a while and have made themselves comfortable without becoming casual, the specific posture of people who are patient but not relaxed. The delegation's lead was a human named Commissioner Adara Solis, and she stood when Vorith Keel entered, which was a courtesy gesture, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting to have a conversation and is now assessing whether the person in front of them is ready for it. You read it, she said. I read it, he said. All of it. Both pages. She nodded. Then you have questions. I have questions, he said. I want to start with the one I can't answer from the text. The photograph. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, sit down. This is going to take a while. What the document contained, and what Commissioner Solis spent the next 2 hours elaborating on in the waiting area of the Senate's emergency session chamber while 49 senators were technically on recess and practically waiting, was an account of something that had happened 114 years ago, before the Senate existed in its current form, before humanity was a member species, before the political architecture that the resolution's architects had used to craft resolution. 7 Tau had been assembled into anything resembling its current structure. 114 years ago, in a period that the Senate's historical records categorized broadly as pre-integration instability, a human colonial installation in the outer territories had been destroyed. Not by a member species. Not by any force with a name in the current political framework. By a category of threat that the Senate's founding documents referred to obliquely, in the deliberately understated language of people who had survived something and were writing about it for people who hadn't and were hoping to ensure they never would. The installation had housed 47,000 people. There had been no survivors. The installation's destruction had predated the current Senate by 9 years. It had occurred during the period of political reorganization that the Senate's historians called the consolidation, and it had been, in the records of that period, one event among many terrible events, documented and acknowledged, and then, as institutions do with things that belong to a past they are trying to move beyond, filed. Not forgotten. Filed. Placed in the category of things that are known but not actively remembered because active remembering is a resource and institutions allocate resources toward the future. The human delegation had not filed it. This was the thing the document explained, across 2 handwritten pages, with the calm and thorough specificity that Vorith Keel had noted on first reading. It explained that the 412 warships were not a recent development. They were not a response to a current threat. They were not, as the Strategic Oversight Committee had characterized them, disproportionate to any legitimate defensive requirement. They were the answer to a question that had been asked 114 years ago at an installation in the Outer Territories, and the question was, what do we need so that this never happens again? The answer the humans had arrived at was 412 ships. They had been building toward that number for 114 years. They had never told the Senate why. Why didn't you tell us? Vorthkiel said. He said it carefully, because the question had several possible answers and some of them were accusations and he didn't intend it as an accusation. Commissioner Solis looked at him with the patient expression she had been wearing since he sat down. When did the Senate first raise concerns about the size of our fleet? She said. He thought about it. Formally? About 12 years ago. There were earlier informal discussions. 18 years ago, she said. The first formal notation in the Strategic Oversight Committee's records referencing our fleet size as a potential concern was 18 years ago. She paused. We submitted a historical context brief to the committee's chair at that time. 40 pages. It described the installation, the event, the timeline of our fleet development, the strategic reasoning. Vorthkiel felt something very cold settle in his chest. I haven't seen that brief. No, Solis said. You haven't. Because the committee's chair at that time reviewed it and determined that the events described predated the Senate's founding and fell outside the committee's current assessment mandate. She said this without heat, without accusation, with the specific quality of someone reporting a fact that has had 18 years to become simply a fact rather than an injustice. The brief was returned to us. It was noted in the committee's records as historical context, non-actionable for current assessment purposes. The silence in the waiting area had the quality of something that has just become larger than the room it's in. They didn't read it, Vorthkiel said. They read it, Solis said. They determined it wasn't relevant. And you didn't escalate. We submitted the brief through the correct channel, she said. The correct channel reviewed it and made a determination. We are a member species operating within the Senate's procedural framework. We used the framework. The framework produced an outcome. She met his eyes steadily. We did not escalate because the framework said the information wasn't actionable, and we trusted the framework. Something in the way she said, trusted, told Vorthkiel that the past tense was doing significant work in that sentence. The data chip, he said. On the table. What's on it? The 40-page brief, she said, and the installation's survivor documentation. There were no survivors, he said. He had read the document. It had been explicit. There were no survivors at the installation, she said. There were people who weren't at the installation when it happened. People who had left on scheduled rotations, on medical transfers, on supply runs. People who came back and found what was left. She paused. The survivor documentation is their testimony, recorded in the weeks after the event. 43 people. Another pause. The youngest was 7 years old. She'd been sent to a neighboring station 2 weeks earlier for a pediatric appointment. Vorthkiel looked at the data chip, standing upright against the photograph on the table visible through the waiting area's window. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. The photograph, he said. The crew of the installation's primary defense vessel, Solis said. They launched when the threat appeared. They were not equipped to stop what was coming. They launched anyway. She was quiet for a moment. They bought approximately 9 minutes. Enough time for the evacuation signal to reach the rotation teams who weren't on site. Enough time for 43 people to know they needed to move. Her voice was even. It had been even throughout. The photograph was taken 6 hours before they launched. Someone had a camera. The waiting area was very quiet. Commissioner Solis, Vorthkiel said. I need to ask you something directly. Yes. If the Senate had read the brief 18 years ago, he stopped. Restarted. If this information had been part of the discussion when Resolution 7 Tau was being drafted, the resolution would not have passed, she said. Simply. Without satisfaction. You know that. I know that 31 senators voted for a resolution without knowing the reason the fleet exists, she said. I know that the Strategic Oversight Committee produced a proportionality assessment without the historical data that defines what proportional means for us. She looked at him. I don't know what the vote would have been with the data. I know what it was without it. Vorethkiel stood. He needed to think, and the thinking required motion, and the waiting area was small enough that motion meant pacing, which he did for approximately 30 seconds while Commissioner Solis watched without comment. The resolution has a 15-day response window, he said, stopping. 11 days have elapsed. The session is in recess waiting for your delegation's formal response. Yes, she said. Your document is not a formal response under the resolution's procedural requirements. No, she said. It isn't. So the resolution is still pending. Yes, she said. And then after a pause, procedural chair. We did not walk out of the session because we are refusing to engage with the resolution. We walked out because we needed you to read that document before we walked back in. Because the conversation we need to have cannot happen in a formal session where 49 senators are hearing the historical context for the first time in real time while also being asked to adjudicate a procedural response. She held his eyes. We need the session recessed for long enough for every senator to read the brief and watch the testimony. That's not a standard procedural option. No, she said. It isn't. The pause. Is it possible? He looked at her. He thought about a committee chair who had returned a 40-page brief 18 years ago because it predated the Senate's founding. He thought about 31 senators who had voted for a proportionality assessment without the data that defined proportionality. He thought about a photograph of people taken 6 hours before they flew into something they couldn't stop, and a child sent to a neighboring station for a pediatric appointment 2 weeks before everything burned. Give me an hour, he said. He spent the hour doing 2 things. The first was reviewing the Senate's procedural code for emergency informational recesses, which were technically permitted under a provision designed for situations involving classified data that senators needed to review before formal proceedings could continue. The provision had been used 4 times in the Senate's history. He had used it once himself. He drafted the recess motion and had it ready for presentation within 40 minutes. The second thing he did was watch 12 minutes of the survivor testimony on the data chip. He stopped at 12 minutes because he needed to stop. Not because the testimony had become unbearable, though it had. Because he needed to be functional for the next several hours, and watching the rest of it now would make that difficult. He stopped at 12 minutes and sat in his office and was still for approximately 5 minutes, which was longer than he had been still in a single uninterrupted period in recent memory. The 7-year-old who had been sent to a neighboring station for a pediatric appointment was in the first 12 minutes. She was not 7 in the testimony. The testimony had been recorded in the weeks after the event, which meant she was still 7. She described, in the language of a 7-year-old who has been asked to explain what she understood, what she had been told about what happened. She described it carefully. She used the phrase, "they didn't come back," 4 times. She had clearly been told something by an adult that she was trying to accurately reproduce, and the accuracy of a 7-year-old's reproduction of adult information about a catastrophic event had a particular quality that Vorethkiel found, at minute 12, that he could not continue watching without compromising his ability to do the next several hours of work. He stopped the playback. He sat for 5 minutes. He went back to the chamber. The recess motion passed 38-11, which was a larger margin than he had expected and which told him that his 1-hour absence had not been spent in isolation. The information had moved through the chamber in the way information moves through a closed system of intelligent people who are waiting for a session to reconvene and have nothing to do but talk to each other. He did not know exactly what had been said, but he knew the margin, and the margin told him enough. The formal recess was declared for 48 hours. Every senator received the data chip's contents through the Senate's secure distribution system. The human delegation returned to the delegation waiting area. Commissioner Solis sent Vorethkiel a single line of text at 1,806 hours into the recess. "Thank you for the hour." He did not respond immediately. He read the 40-page brief instead, all of it in his office, with his door closed. He read it twice. The brief was not written in the formal diplomatic language he had expected. It was written in the direct, unornamented style of the document on the table, the style of people who have decided that clarity matters more than palatability. It described the installation's destruction in technical detail and in human detail simultaneously, and the combination was more difficult to read than either would have been alone. The technical sections explained what had happened to the installation in terms of force and structure and material consequence. The human sections described what 47,000 lives looked like before they ended, the things the installation had been doing, the work its people had been engaged in, the ordinary texture of a community that had not anticipated what was coming. One passage, approximately halfway through the brief, stopped him. It described the decision made by Earth's Governance Council in the months following the event. Not the decision to build ships, he had understood that from the document on the table. The decision about how to build them. The brief described a debate about whether to publicize the fleet development program, whether to explain it openly, whether to invite external understanding and buy-in. It described the argument that transparency would have produced, concerns about human militarization, questions about strategic intent, debates about proportionality from bodies that lacked the context to understand what proportionality meant from inside the event. And it described the decision that the council had ultimately made, which was to build quietly, to explain only when directly asked, and to trust that a Senate founded on the principle of collective security would, when the moment came and the question was asked directly, be willing to understand the answer. The trust had been misplaced 18 years ago by a committee chair who had returned a 40-page brief without reading it carefully. And the humans had not escalated because they had decided to trust the framework, and the framework had failed them, and they had continued building ships, and the ships had continued being characterized by people who didn't know what they were actually looking at. Vorethkiel set the brief down. He thought about the 11 senators who had voted against the recess motion. He thought about what their votes meant. Not obstruction, not cruelty, but the specific institutional reflex of people who have built a framework and are protective of it, who see a procedural deviation as a threat to the thing they've spent careers maintaining. He understood the reflex. He had felt it himself when Commissioner Solis had asked if an extended recess was possible, had felt the immediate instinct to say no, the procedure exists for a reason, the procedure must be followed. The reflex was not wrong. It was just incomplete without the information it was refusing to receive. He thought about 47,000 people. He thought about 9 minutes. He thought about someone with a camera 6 hours before. He sent Commissioner Solis a response to her text. It said, "I owe you more than an hour. I owe you 18 years, *." She replied 30 minutes later, "The framework owed us 18 years. You gave us what you could. That's what frameworks are for, *." The full session reconvened at the end of the 48-hour recess. The chamber was different from the chamber Vorethkiel had called to order 2 days before. Not visibly, not in any physical sense, the same curved dais, the same seating, the same procedural architecture. Different in the way rooms are different when the people in them have spent 48 hours with information that changed what they understand. The human delegation was present. All 6. They sat at their table with the document and the photograph and the data chip arranged the same way they had been arranged when the delegation left, because no one had moved them during the recess and the delegation had clearly chosen not to move them on their return. Vorethkiel opened the session. He did the procedural things that needed to be done, the formal recording of the recess and its duration and the materials distributed during it, the administrative architecture of a session resuming after an interruption. Then he did something that was not in the procedural code and that he had decided to do anyway during the 48 hours. He said, "Before this session proceeds to formal business, I want to state for the record, as procedural chair, that the Senate's Strategic Oversight Committee received a historical context brief from the human delegation 18 years ago that was returned without full consideration. That brief contained information material to the proportionality assessment that formed the basis of Resolution 7 Tau. The resolution was passed without this information. I am recording this formally, and I am requesting that the resolution's co-sponsors address the floor before we proceed to a response vote." The chamber was very quiet. The resolution's primary co-sponsor, a senator named Ovithdel who had been doing this work for 30 years and who Vorthkiel knew as someone who was never comfortable being wrong and was always, eventually, willing to admit it, stood. He stood for a moment without speaking. He looked at the human delegation's table. He looked at the photograph in its frame. "I watched the testimony," he said. "All of it." He paused. The child who had been sent away for a medical appointment. "She's 67 years old now." Another pause. "She submitted a written statement to be included with the testimony archive. I read it last night. She became a structural engineer. She spent her career designing emergency evacuation systems for colonial installations." He stopped. "She said she didn't become an engineer instead of doing something else. She said she became an engineer because of what happened, because the 9 minutes mattered, because the people who bought those 9 minutes deserved to have their 9 minutes worth something." His voice was steady. It was clearly an effort for it to be steady. Resolution 7 Tau was drafted without her testimony. Without the brief. Without the photograph. Without any of the context that explains why the number is what it is. He paused one final time. "I am withdrawing my co-sponsorship and requesting a full procedural review of the resolution's basis." The second co-sponsor withdrew within the session's first hour. The third within the second hour. By the end of the session, Resolution 7 Tau had been formally suspended pending the proportionality review that the Strategic Oversight Committee was now required to conduct with the full historical brief as foundational context. The review would take 6 months. The findings would be, as these findings tend to be when the facts are clear, uncomfortable for the institution and clarifying for everyone. The final assessment would determine that the human fleet, measured against the documented threat environment that had defined its development mandate, was not disproportionate. That the proportionality framework the committee had been using was inadequate because it had been built without the historical data that defined what adequate meant. And that the Senate's intake process for member species' historical context briefs required fundamental revision, because something had failed 18 years ago that the current process would fail again. Commissioner Solis read the final assessment in Vorthkiel's office, where he had invited her because he wanted to see her read it and he was not entirely certain he could explain why. She read it carefully in the same way she did everything. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't give us the 18 years, she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't. The process revision is good. The proportionality framework revision is necessary." She set the assessment down. "It doesn't give us the 18 years. "Nothing does," he said. She looked at him with an expression that he had been trying to categorize since the waiting area and had not fully managed. It was not grievance. It was not satisfaction. It was something between those two things, in the space that exists when a person has been waiting a long time for something and it has finally arrived and the arrival is real and it is also not the same as if it had arrived when it should have. "Commissioner," he said. "The photograph. On the table. You left it." "Yes. You could have taken it back." "It belongs on the table," she said. "It belongs in this building." She stopped, and for the first time in every conversation he had witnessed, the evenness in her voice fractured slightly, something small and honest and briefly visible. "They deserve to be in the room for this. Even in a photograph. Even after 114 years. Vorthkiel looked out his office window at the Senate chamber visible below, at the curved dais and the 49 seats and the human delegations table where the photograph still sat. He had not moved it. He had not asked anyone to move it. He found that he did not want it moved. He thought about the Senate's proportionality review. He thought about the process revision. He thought about the 6 months of work ahead. He thought about 31 senators who had voted for a resolution without understanding what they were asking, and about a committee chair who had returned a 40-page brief, and about an institution that had been doing the thing institutions do, managing the present without fully understanding what the past had built. He thought about 412 ships that had been built, one by one, across 114 years, by people who had decided that the answer to an unanswerable question was to keep building until the answer felt real. He thought about 9 minutes. He thought that the Senate would spend a long time after this understanding something it had not understood before, that when a species builds something quietly, without announcement, without asking for recognition, and maintains it for over a century across every political change and every institutional pressure and every moment when a different choice would have been easier, the silence is not absence. The silence is the most serious thing they have. And when the institution finally asks why, and the answer is 2 pages of careful handwriting on actual paper, and a photograph of people who flew into something they couldn't stop, and a data chip with a 7-year-old's voice explaining that they didn't come back, the right response is not proportionality. The right response is to sit down and listen, and not stop listening until you understand.